Alright, good afternoon and welcome back to the channel. If you're new, welcome. I know a lot of you came in through the retard maxing video. I hope that was a helpful video for you, a good way to approach the spiritual life. Today we're looking at another very important question, which is how do you grow in discipline? What does it look like on a neurobiological level? Now this comes from when I was studying last semester. I had a psychology course where I was able to select the topic of my research paper, and I thought that I'd do something that could be useful to my audience, because I've discussed virtue before. I did that video about Aristotle where he talks about the evil, the incontinent, the continent, and the virtuous man, where the virtuous man is the man that not only does the good but desires to do so. The continent man does the good, but his internal state isn't yet habituated to it, so he's kind of still forcing himself. Then the incontinent guy is the guy that knows that there's something good that he should be doing. However, he doesn't have the willpower or doesn't actually do it. So he knows that there is good, but he can't do it, so he does the evil thing. And finally, you've got the evil man, who not only doesn't do the good, but he doesn't even desire to do it. So what we're talking about here is basically moving from the incontinent man to the continent man, the man that knows that there is something good that he should be doing, and now he's actually starting to do it. He's forcing himself to do it. And I wanted to understand what this looks like from a neurobiological perspective. Like how is someone actually able to push themselves to do something that they don't want to do? And I think I found some answers, so hopefully you will bear with me and this is helpful to you. So at the most basic level, how do we view motivation for action? A child reaches for a cookie because he wants sugar, and sugar tastes good. So the reward is immediate, obvious, and the behavior makes sense. Now take someone that goes to the gym. It's kind of harder to explain because the gym involves real suffering and discomfort, but eventually it produces rewards that are large enough and the behavior repeats. So these might be social benefits, it might be physical improvement, psychological elevation after a hard session. We already know that there's things like epinephrine and different hormones released. So we can kind of trace the reward back to that behavior. There's a third category of behavior that neither of these frameworks can explain, and that's behavior that has no immediate reward. So no material reward, you could say. The behavior of men and women who pursued lives of radical suffering, deprivation, and ultimately death for the sake of a conviction. The martyrs. From a purely biological standpoint, this makes no sense because there's no actual reward in that action on any kind of human level. The strongest instinct in any organism is self-preservation. So to give up the most valuable thing that you have, which is your life, for the sake of an idea, I would say a person, cannot be explained by any reward-based model of motivation. So what the heck are we dealing with when it comes to being motivated to do something? Because we've probably already experienced times in our lives where we are super unmotivated, but there's obviously a degree to which our brain can override the motivations of our body. So what I want to argue in this video, drawing on what we now understand about dopamine, the prefrontal cortex, and the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, is that a man who practices virtue consistently can actually condition his neurochemistry to find genuinely rewarding what the untrained man only finds costly, and that the biology eventually catches up to the moral life. But more than that, I want to answer the practical question underneath all of this, because once you understand that this rewiring is actually a possibility, I want to also tell you how to do it. How do you force yourself through actions that feel genuinely terrible when your brain has given you every signal to stop? So let's start with what dopamine is, because I've realized that the pop psychology understanding of it is actually wrong. Most people think of dopamine as a reward chemical, when you do something and it's like you get the sugar hit, something that surges after you've done the activity. But that's not quite right. What dopamine actually does is that it surges in anticipation of a rewarding action. So not afterwards, but before it. And this is the same mechanism that's in that famous psychology experiment called Pavlovs dogs. And it's called a conditioned response. So basically, these dogs the bell would ring and the scientists would bring the dog food. And they did that over and over again. And eventually the scientist would ring the bell and the dog would start salivating without the doctor actually bringing food in. So he had been conditioned to respond to the sound of the bell, and he associated with that, with the reward, or with what was going to come, which was the food. So the dog was reacting to the prediction of food. And that's the same as dopamine. Dopamine encodes for the prediction of a reward, the anticipation. So it's actually an association that we make. What's the word that they use? It's a conditioned association that happens with our environment between a set of conditions and a reward that has followed those conditions before. So to come back to that example of the kid reaching for the cookie, he's eaten enough cookies to know that they have sugar and that sugar tastes good. So when he sees the jar, or when he knows the cookies are on the table, he experiences a surge of dopamine that initiates that behavior, the seeking of the cookie. He hasn't eaten the cookie yet, but the dopamine is already firing. And it's that dopamine which surges in response to learned conditions that drives him across the kitchen to find the cookie, grab it, and eat it. Now let's scale this up to more complex behavior. Consider someone who's just started going to the gym. The first session might not require heaps of motivation. It's kind of new, it might be interesting, whatever. But if he has a positive experience, if he feels that post-training elevation, notices the hormonal shift, starts to see his physique change, his brain now begins to form an association between the gym and those rewards. And the more that he repeats that behavior, the stronger that association becomes. So now when he checks the calendar and he knows that he's got a gym session scheduled that morning, he actually experiences a surge of dopamine, just like that kid did in response to the cookie, to the gym. The dopamine doesn't come as a result of him having gone to the gym. It fires an anticipation. And that's why people colloquially describe motivation or discipline as it's easier now because I'm motivated to do it. The body automatically starts to desire it. And that's what we would say is a habit, or a self-sustaining habit. Now, here is where the nuance comes in, because the dopamine system, it doesn't actually distinguish between behaviors that are good for you and behaviors that are bad for you. It just encodes the associations. And that's when you look at an example of a pornography addiction, which I don't think any person who's in that desires to be in it or desires to continue in that. But the mechanism is identical to the guy who goes to the gym every day. The same anticipatory dopamine fires when the conditions are right. So the guy who is thinking about it, he's doing nothing, he's lying in his bed with a phone in his hand, the brain starts to go down that neurological rut because it knows that if it does that action, it's going to get a certain set of rewards. So that pull of the anticipation is actually already present before you've made a conscious decision to do something. And it would be the same with the guy who goes to the gym and the same with the kid that goes looking for the cookie. There's a neurochemical that his history of repeated behavior has created. All right, so because he's done that so many times, he's fired that reward mechanism over and over and over again. When his body, biological body, finds itself in that situation, it starts to anticipate that which is going to bring it the reward. But it can be encoded in different directions, as I said. So the question is never whether or not dopamine will drive your behavior. We know it's going to, whether that be to something positive or negative. And now the question is, what are you going to train yourself to seek? So if dopamine builds these pathways through repetition, regardless of what the behavior is there a way to change these pathways? Is there any means of breaking a deeply entrenched dopaminergic habit and building a new one in its place? Now this is where our prefrontal cortexes, or cortices, and the anterior mid-cingulate cortex become relevant. We know that we are not purely dopamine-driven systems, or we'd be animals. We have the capacity to act based on reason and on what we know to be good, even when what we feel drawn towards is something else entirely. The prefrontal cortex is the structure that makes this possible. It is what allows a man to override a dopaminergic pull and act against it through what we commonly call willpower. I think everyone's experienced this before. Consider a guy who's never gone for a run and he decides to start. His body has no established dopaminergic association with running. In fact, dopamine can actually drop below the baseline to discourage certain behaviors because running is energetically expensive and the brain has no evidence that it produces anything worth seeking after. Same with like a cold shower, right? But with sufficient engagement of the prefrontal cortex, he can override that low dopamine signal. He can force himself out the door and complete the run through sheer effort of will. And this is what the early stages of any new discipline feel like. It's not just difficulty, it's neurological resistance. Your brain is genuinely working against you, withholding that dopamine that would normally make an action feel natural or desirable. And it comes back to that point. This is because it hasn't built the association. So you're operating against your own wiring. Here's what you might be thinking. Well, there's times where I simply can't force myself to do something. And this is true. You know, this has been studied, that this override of the willpower over the dopamine or the more basic neurological circuits can only take you so far. The prefrontal cortex is metabolically expensive to run. So every time that you do something based purely on willpower, it literally costs you energy. And the stronger the competing dopaminergic pool, the more energy that override requires. They did a study where you had to keep your hand in cold water for a certain amount of time. And I can't remember exactly how it went, but basically the people that had to keep their hand in icy water for over a minute or something, they were presented with another challenge and they were way more likely to fold as opposed to the person that didn't, because for whatever reason, keeping the hand in there had depleted their willpower levels. So that resource runs out. You can force yourself to run a 5K race based on willpower, but if I'm suddenly forcing myself to run a half marathon or an ultra marathon, there's probably going to come to a point somewhere where while physically my muscles could have the energy to keep running, I'm just not going to be able to. Goggins would say otherwise, but that's a different example. But you know what I mean? You can only push yourself so far, and you can only push yourself so consistently. If I was relying purely on my willpower to do acts of human endurance, well, eventually I'm going to gas out, right? And it's the same, you know, when people are trying to deal with negative habits. It can become very difficult to abstain from something so neurologically rewarding as pornography. And that's why I think most people fail when they approach discipline, because they're forcing themselves to use that willpower when willpower can only take you so much of the distance. And that's why you kind of need a bit more structure and a bit more of a game plan to actually rewire these circuits. And it also illustrates the need for perseverance, that while some people may give up within a couple of days, within a week, within 3-4 weeks, maybe your dopamine circuits are so badly wired that it's going to take you longer than that to rewire. Like, I don't actually know how long this takes. I'm going to get into more how it works, but maybe you just had to keep on persevering and that would rewire and you'd start to rewire the right rewards. So what is the actual process of this programming of dopamine? So what research shows is that if a man persists in behavior long enough and begins to experience any kind of meaningful reward from it, whether that be physical, psychological, or social, the brain begins to naturally form that association, and it starts to encode that behavior as worth anticipating. And over time, the dopamine fires before the action, exactly in the same way that it fires before the behaviors that he was trying to leave behind. So the guy who forces himself to go to the gym for 6 weeks, let's say, and he's finding it hard to get that motivation to go, he might start noticing something shift around week 7 or 8. The post-training elevation becomes familiar. The body begins to change. The identity of being a man who trains starts to take root. And his brain is learning that this behavior produces something worth having and starts to release dopamine in anticipation of it. So he still has to go to the gym, and he still goes to the gym, but now the neurochemistry is working in his favor instead of against him. He's no longer finding himself out the door. And this is what Angela Duckworth, who wrote a great book called Grit, says, where she says that passion and perseverance through sustained practice, become self-sustaining rather than a matter of willpower. And that self-sustaining is kind of the goal that we all want to get to. The goal of willpower is not to just endure pain forever, but the goal is to get through it for long enough that the dopamine system begins to rewire. And I guess I'll also add an asterisk, which you guys will probably already know, but it's not like then once you've crossed this magical barrier that going to the gym and waking up early is suddenly all rainbows and daisies. You know, there's still going to be the physical discomfort of the moment, but it's not going to be as you know, doom and gloom from the perspective of your brain, neurologically speaking, because now your brain is aware at some fundamental level that this stuff is actually good for you. So there's the immediate biological resistance, but there's not so much of that other kind of resistance, which is what we've talked about in the top half of the video. So what does the practical process actually look like? The first thing to understand is that you're not trying to feel good about the action during the early period. You're not going to the gym because it feels rewarding yet. You're going because you need enough repetitions in your behavior for your brain to build that association. It's kind of a data collection phase of your own neurochemistry. And the second thing is, and this is something that James Clear talks a lot about in Atomic Habits, which I recommend looking at because these are all tools in your tool belt that you can use to build the habits that you want. So what did I say? Reduce the cost of the prefrontal cortex override. So if every session requires maximal willpower, you're going to exhaust that resource before the rewiring is complete. So you want to try to remove friction from the new behavior and add friction to the old one. For example, the gym bag is packed the night before and you leave your clothes and your shoes right there by your door. Instead of having to go through all of the effort of trying to find stuff and putting it together, you step into your shoes half asleep and you're out the door before you've even had time to think. The alarm that's waking you up, instead of having it right by your bed where you can click that bright orange button, have it across the room so you have to get out and turn it off. The phone placed in a different room entirely, right? When you're going to sleep or when you're trying to study. You've removed that distraction. It's no longer so easy to do that behavior, which is doom scrolling, watching pornography. So these are structural interventions that reduce how much override energy each repetition of the behavior that you want requires. So the less each rep costs, the more reps you can accumulate before the dopamine catches up. Let me give you another great example. A lot of people will find it easier to start going to the gym when they have a coach or when they have a gym buddy, because now there's a bit of a social element to the activity. So they have a bit more motivation to go and they form the habit. So that's an example where now they've reduced the friction or they've added appeal to that unappealing action until they reinforce and build that habit. And of course, you'll surely understand this in the inverse. It's not like once a habit's formed, you can never lose it. The same mechanism by which we build a habit is the same mechanism by which we can lose a habit if it starts to get harder to do and we're not rewarding ourselves. So we're not just avoiding temptation as an act of moral discipline or as an execution of the prefrontal cortex, but we're really trying to reduce activation of the old pathway so that the new one can form without constant competition. Remove the triggers, restructure the idle time, change what fills the hours that that old behavior used to fill. Gaming, you know, if you're playing all of these hours and it's super, you know, neurologically rewarding, well, you'll need to find something else to fill in that time that might have a different kind of set of rewards. Now, I just want to wrap up with this, which is the secular self-improvement world, this kind of psychology that I've been talking about, it kind of only takes you to a certain point, because I feel like this kind of framework, it adds in the scientific language to what theology and philosophy have known for a long time, which is virtue. Specifically, the distinction between the continent man and the virtuous man. The continent man, like I described at the start of the video, is the man who's in that rewiring period. Intellectually, he knows the good, and he is forcing himself to do it, but he does not yet desire it. It doesn't come from the heart. He has to fight himself every time. He does the right thing, but it costs him everything. And you could say that the continent man is relying on the prefrontal cortex override to get through each day. So he is disciplined, but he's not yet virtuous. The virtuous man is the man whose dopamine has truly been retrained. So he no longer wants what he used to want, which was sin. The discipline has become habitual. His soul, his inner disposition, his dopaminergic circuits do and want the good. So that habitual is kind of that neurological circuit. The wiring now naturally inclines him to do the good. So that's where that momentum, that self-sustaining habit comes in. So the goal is not to become a man who grinds through that resistance every single day, but you'll eventually become someone who genuinely wants what is good. And therefore it's much more natural. In some ways it is easier to do. And this is achieved by forming the mind in that way. Now there's millions of other ways that we form our mind that is not just about actions. That's why it's so important to read books, to read biographies, to spend time around the kind of people that you want to become, because all of these different inputs, they shape your desires. So, final point. How do you explain the martyrs? How do you explain men and women who embraced death for the sake of conviction, with no material reward and no biological incentive to do so? The answer is that they are kind of at the end of this whole process. So, obviously, I'm not speaking from experience here, so I'm only speculating, but you can imagine that the man who's practiced virtue consistently over years, who has repeatedly overridden comfort, appetite, and self-preservation in the small acts of daily discipline and the daily mortifications, has been conditioning his neurochemistry through that entire time. He's been running the same process that we have been describing in the direction of the good, that the dopamine system has fully rewired. So what the untrained man finds costly, sacrifice, suffering, self-denial, the fully formed man finds genuinely rewarding, because that is who he has become. The biology has caught up to the moral life. So the martyr standing in front of his executors is not white-knuckling that override of the survival instinct, but in some ways he is actually being himself. He has been trained over years of daily virtue into a man for whom fidelity to God is literally the most neurologically natural thing he can do. Now, P.S. Martyrdom is a grace from God. I don't know if this is possible purely with natural powers, although if you look at the example of Socrates, in some ways he was a martyr for the truth. So I think there's probably more to this than we actually realize. But that's the finish line. You know, not a man who fights himself into obedience every day for the rest of his life, but a man who has been formed through the slow, unglamorous, repetitive work of daily discipline into someone for whom obedience is no longer a fight. So that's the process. Force the behavior through that resistance period, reduce the cost of each override, quiet the competing pathway, and repeat that for long enough that the neurochemistry builds the association. Let the dopamine system work for you instead of against you. All right, so that's the neurobiology of discipline, how to form new habits, how to rewire the dopamine pathways. I can probably put the studies which I referenced within this video in the description if all the science nerds want the data. But ultimately, as I said, I think this really just fills in the gaps between what we already knew from a philosophical and theological perspective and growing in the moral life, and now where we are in the modern world with the data and the science and the studies to prove that. So let me know if you found that helpful. Let me know what takeaways you brought in. Let me know what habits you're going to try and form with this new system. Check out my other videos, especially check out that video on virtue. It'll probably help clarify this entire thing. And yeah, I'll leave you with that. Make sure you follow my other social media platforms. I'm on Instagram. We're kicking off the X, the Twitter. You can find these videos in audio form on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you want to join a community of men who are building virtue, who are building these habits, who are supporting each other in the moral life and the life of grace. Check out the link in the description. It's called The Legion. We have weekly coaching calls covering videos and topics like this, as well as a lot of back and forth, goal setting, challenges, supporting each other, weekly wins. Basically, all of the right kind of inputs to help you become a better man instead of a neutral one or a worse one, which is unfortunately a lot of what you find on the internet. So with that, please subscribe, leave a like, drop a comment, and may God bless you.